Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on Flash Talks, talking about research agenda for political demography. So we're really grateful to IUSSP and Tom LeGrand in particular for having the invitation to bring political demography to this distinguished group. It has not always been part of the mainstream of really any discipline, and a lot of us presenting today have backgrounds in political science or sociology, some in demography, but have really focused on the political angles of demography throughout their careers. And along with, I believe, the recorded session that just from already this morning on identity and politics, these two sessions discuss political demography as relates to two recently published works. And so I believe John May has a prop for us. Check this out. There's one of them. So all of the people speaking today are authors in this book that I edited, A Research Agenda for Political Demography. And rest assured, I will put some links in the chat on that. So make sure your libraries have that on order. We also, it's a good year for political demography. There's another book out on global political demography that's an open access book. And I'll put the link to that there as well. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and launch into the presentations. The order in which we'll go, we'll hear from Jack Goldstone first, Jack Goldstone of George Mason University, and then Caitlin Paterno from the Population Reference Bureau. Jeremy Ute is unable to join us this morning, so we'll go straight to John May after that, also George Mason University. Michael Teitelbaum of the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard, and Richard Sincata from the Stimson Center. So thank you all very much. And I'd like to encourage you to use the chat throughout the presentations because most of these are videos. We have the unique advantage of the presenters possibly being able to monitor the chat as well and answer some questions in real time. And we're trying to make this more conversational so that we can really introduce the idea of political demography to a wider group. So please feel free to use the chat. Once again, I'm Jennifer Shuba. Thank you for those of us just joining us. And let's go ahead and cue the first video, please. Thanks. Do you have everything you need, Tangela, for that one?
There we go. Hi, I'm Jack Goldstone from George Mason University, and I'm speaking today about population, rebellion, and revolution. There are a few keys to understanding the relationship between population change and politics, what we call political demography. First, it's never just about the population numbers. It's always about how population change interacts with political institutions and economic trends. For example, rapid population growth can be a positive factor if the economy and wages are growing strongly, and the government has sufficient tax revenues to invest in education, infrastructure, public health, and public safety, as for example in Japan after 1960 or in China after 1980. But such growth can also be a negative factor, raising the risks of political protests and rebellion if the economy is growing slowly, or if funds are diverted away from government, leading to low investment in the areas that are critically needed to respond to population growth. Understanding how population changes, which can include population growth, decay, aging, urbanization, or immigration, understanding how these changes interact with institutions is really what we need to understand. Now, demographic changes can lead to revolution and rebellion by either of two pathways. It can be caused by sustained population growth in societies that have rigid or inflexible institutions. That combination produces a population growth syndrome of disorder and discontent with the growth of radical ideologies. But revolution and rebellion can also be the result of sustained population stagnation or decline. That produces a population stagnation syndrome of economic and political frustration and mass protests that can lead to populism in democracies or to greater democracy in authoritarian regimes. Let's talk about the population growth syndrome for just a moment. If growth occurs in the context of slow or highly uneven economic growth, that leads to blocked social mobility and rising inequality, as many members of the new youth cohort are unable to find positions in society. Such growth can also lead to rising prices, which causes the government to raise taxes or to cut spending and increase its debts. Population growth also leads to rapid urbanization, while government services such as education, welfare spending, healthcare, housing, and job creation can all lag behind that growth. Population growth also produces a youth bulge, that is, larger and larger youth cohorts, and that often increases recruitment to radical groups who are particularly attractive to the idealistic young. Now, in autocracies, this combination often leads to radical revolutions, even civil wars, or sometimes to military regimes to impose order on what seems like an increasingly disordered society where people can't find their stable roles. In democracies, though, you can have the same type of problem, and then it leads to democratic backsliding, often to authoritarian or military regimes. For example, the famous French, Russian, Chinese, and Mexican revolutions, the revolutions in Iran and Nicaragua in 1979, all showed the effects of a population growth syndrome in a society with kind of rigid economy and political institutions that did not smoothly allow a new, younger generation to move into positions of economic work and political influence. The Arab uprisings were similar, but in Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Nigeria today, we're seeing weak democracies also struggling with population growth, and the result has been a kind of creeping authoritarianism, or in some cases, the outbreak in Ethiopia of civil war as the variety of claims has been unable to be met. The population stagnation or decay syndrome operates differently, but again, it's an imbalance or misfit between the changing population and institutions. Where large-scale immigration or sustained fertility decline leads to a stable or falling population, then if economic growth and prices are also stable or declining, government will find tax revenues stagnate or decline. That can lead to declining public services, which are no longer well funded, to corruption as government officials seek to improve their lot, and especially to falling trust in government and greater self-reliance in civil society groups. Now, in democracies, this decline of public services and decline of trust can lead to populism or even to revived authoritarianism as an appealing nationalist alternative. In autocracies, this type of decay can lead to color revolutions, where people seek to replace authoritarian regimes with more responsive and more democratic government. And again, we have lots of examples. Historically, late Tokugawa Japan was an early example of a political system that fell due to population stagnation and decay. More recently, we've seen in Eastern Europe in the 80s and 90s, and now in the United States and Europe in the 2010s, and even in China in the 2020s, some of the issues that arise from population stagnation leading to a more assertive authoritarian governance. I'm going to go through just 3 quick quantitative examples to show how we can put political demography into action by plotting variables and their change over time. My colleague Peter Turchin developed this graph, looking at political stress in the United States of America from a demographic structural model. This model built a well-being index, the blue line, looking at things like wages, political polarization, inequality, and the two red lines, the political stress index, kind of inverts that and says what happens when wages are falling, inequality is growing, political polarization is increasing. And we find very clearly that in the United States, we had one period of great instability, the first age of discord around the American Civil War. Here, the instability index shot up from the 1840s to the 1860s. And we see the same phenomenon today. And Turchin and I feel this augurs a period of greater political violence and instability. Certainly the January 6th attack on the US Capitol by crowds seeking to overturn the democratic outcome of the election, something really unprecedented in American history since the 19th century. But we predict we will see this type of violence and contention continue based on the political demography translated into this demographic structural model. Now, a simpler relationship, but a very strong one, has been identified by my friend and colleague, Richard Sincata. He has shown that there's a very strong relationship between age structure and democracy. Regardless of which decade we look at, from the 70s to the 2000s, we see that mature age societies, that's the M, societies with a mature age structure, that is median age over 35, have a very high incidence of democracy. 80% are recorded as free by Freedom House. On the other side, if we look at young societies with median age 25 or less than 20% of such societies are rated free by Freedom House, again, across 4 decades. And then intermediate societies have roughly intermediate levels of democracy. So this tells us that as societies move from young to intermediate to more mature, they are also much more likely to become stable democracies, which means that countries that are kind of out of this relationship, countries like Russia, China, Belarus, that have a mature age population but are not yet free, are good candidates for democratic color revolutions in the future. Finally, I would worry about Africa and South Asia, given what's happening to the youth population in those countries. That is, in the next 20 and 40 years, the number of 15 to 44-year-olds in Africa, that's the red, in South Asia, green, is really just going to jump almost double from what it is today. Unless the societies of Africa and South Asia can cope with those huge rising youth cohorts, they are likely to see and are already seeing ideological radical movements, protests, rebellions, and even civil wars. Let me end with 3 questions for further research. First, we certainly want to know how modern societies can survive the slowdown and decline of population that will inevitably accompany their below replacement fertility. Will high immigration help, or will it be too politically risky? Can automation aid this transition and create a positive, or will it put too many people out of work? Conversely, where population is growing fast in Africa and Asia, can those countries have stronger governments to help avoid the likelihood of widespread political disorder? And finally, what will be the political impact of the coming global shift in religion? One demographic change I did not mention is that Islam is likely to displace Christianity as the world's largest religion by the middle of this century. What effect will that have on politics around the world? If you're interested in more, a number of recent books have been published on political demography that provide much food for thought. Political Demography Reader that I edited, a volume on global political demography from Achim Gers, Peter van Hus, and the research agenda for political demography, which we're previewing for you today, by Jennifer Schuba. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. And we really can see this role of the population pressures there. You have a question in the chat. If you are so inclined, I'd encourage you to engage in that during the next presentation or throughout the next few presentations. And Tangela, I believe next we have Caitlin Paterno from Population Reference Bureau. If you can please cue that video.
Of course, just give me 1 minute.
Sure. Welcome those of you who joined us during our first presentation. Please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions of the presenters and presenters to each other.
Okay.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our special session today. My name is Caitlin Paterno.
Sounds great, Caitlin. We'll see you on in a second.
Analysis that aims to conceptually broaden the classic definition of the demographic dividend. The analysis shows how age structure change could generate benefits across 4 sectors: the economy, health, education, and governance and stability.
And Tangela, we can't see that one, just so you know.
I'm sorry, is it? I'm sorry, I think I'm having an issue. 1 second.
Sure. And it's possible, and I'll just go ahead and preview this for the other presenters. I don't know if Rich and Michael, you happen to have your videos, but we could always think about having the individual presenters share them if there's tech problem.
Yeah, I think that file was just a little, it's larger, so it's not letting me share it the normal way, but let me try it.
How about this, Caitlin, do you think that you have your video that you could go a little bit later and we could show a different video next?
Let me try to share it, Jennifer.
Okay.
Let me try to share it from my computer.
Okay,
I downloaded it. I think I should be able to do this in. Is this working?
Says that you have started screen sharing, but I still don't see the file. Oh, there, this is looking good. We can at least see the slides.
I think if you just share the sound. Once you press play, it should work.
Oh, God. Yeah, let me stop this.
And I
Mhm,
think
I'll do it
Caitlin has
like
it
this.
open. If we can, can we have her share if this doesn't work?
I think this is going to work now. Just sorry.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our special session today. My name is Caitlin Paterno. I'm a program director at PRB, and today, on behalf of my co-authors, I will briefly share a PRB analysis looking at the evidence around the contribution of specific policy interventions to attainment of the demographic dividend, and discuss the need for more research on specific actionable policy recommendations. As a reminder, the demographic dividend is the accelerated economic growth countries can achieve as their age structure matures through the demographic transition from high to low fertility and mortality. The demographic dividend, or the DD, is conceptually appealing to policymakers. In contrast to old arguments about population growth and resource scarcity, it is optimistic, offering the prospect of economic benefit following demographic change. More recently, PRB has supported analysis that aims to conceptually broaden the classic definition of the demographic dividend. The analysis shows how age structure change could generate benefits across 4 sectors: the economy, health, education, and governance and stability. We do this by identifying specific points in the demographic transition at which countries cross a 50% probability threshold and become more likely than not to attain a level of progress in each of the 4 sectors. The analysis shows that among countries with a youthful population, as the median age of the population increases, a window of opportunity opens in which countries are likely to experience improvements in maternal and child survival, educational attainment, income and economic transformation, and government effectiveness, citizen participation, control of corruption, and political stability. While enthusiasm around these ideas remains high, the benefits of the DD are not straightforward to attain. Many DD-oriented development agendas are both broad and vague, and progress towards achievement of the dividend's potential economic boost remains elusive. The number of countries that have successfully achieved a dividend is few, less than 10, according to the body of economic research, and mostly concentrated in East Asia. In response to the need for targeted guidance for countries that wish to attain a DD, PRB examined the evidence for specific policy interventions across sectors that motivate or inhibit attainment of the dividend. The findings of our review were very limited. Few studies quantify the impact of specific policy interventions to attainment of the dividend. The literature was most robust in examining the contribution of policies related to family planning and reproductive health, with findings showing policy changes to make family planning services more accessible contributed substantially to the DD by stimulating age structure change and increasing female labor force participation. Investments in human capital, particularly the health and education of the population, also emerged as a theme. 2 studies demonstrate that the early economic benefits of age structure change must be at least partially reinvested in the human capital of future workers to maximize the dividend. 3 studies examining macroeconomic policy changes suggest that policies that promote open trade and encourage foreign direct investment substantially contribute to the DD. And finally, while several studies of the dividend include a generalized variable around good governance, we only found 1 study documenting the contribution of specific governance-related policy interventions to the DD. So what can we take away from this? As countries continue to develop demographic dividend roadmaps and incorporate the DD into national development and vision strategies, it is important to continue to build and clearly articulate the evidence base for policy recommendations. To date, however, we find that the literature remains very scant. Policy interventions identified in the review with the most robust evidence include an enabling legal and policy environment for voluntary family planning access and use, an economy open to trade and investment, and investing GDP growth in human capital development of the population. Our review pointed to many further areas for inquiry, some of which I've highlighted here. First, more research quantifying the contribution of specific policies to attainment of the DD is needed. Second, particularly in view of the limited number of countries that attained a dividend, identifying policy failures in countries whose favorable age structures met with only tepid economic outcomes could steer others toward success. Third, as countries move through the demographic transition, further research on policy investments that maximize the size and lengthen the duration of the window of opportunity is critical. Fourth, we need to better understand the spectrum of gender, cultural, and economic barriers that lead to trade-offs between women's workforce participation and attaining their desired family size. With that, thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Definitely can get a sense from the first two presentations that one of the goals of our book, which was of course a research agenda, was to point out what we know and what we don't know. And when it comes to the demographic dividend, there's certainly a lot that we don't know, particularly as we try to translate some of this research into policy. So that's really valuable that you pointed that out. Thank you. So our third presenter will be John May. And whenever you're ready, John, you can go ahead and share screen. And then after John, we'll have Michael Titlebaum. Thank you.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon. My name is John May. I am a demographer. I work at the George Mason University as a research professor. I am a colleague of Jack Goldstone, and I am attached to the Schar School of Policy and Government. The chapter I am going to summarize today, it's called the Research Agenda for Youth Policies and Investment. First of all, I would like to stress that today, 41% of the world population is under the age of 25. This proportion is probably going to increase a little bit over the next decades before it will start to decrease because of population aging, low fertility, etc. In some parts of the world, fertility is still high, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's close to 4.8 children per woman. And that will probably decrease, but we don't know at which pace and how soon this fertility will decrease. The chapter is divided in three main sections. The first one is looking at the youth definitions, there are several, and data access. The second part of the book is the youth training and the challenges of the youth. And there are different challenges the youth needs to face. And the third and last major part of the chapter is looking at the youth opportunities. Now, the definition is a bit of a problem. Traditionally, demographers have always said that the youth is from 0 to 15 exact or 14 completed, but it's a bit more complex than that because a lot of youth need to go to secondary education. So the group should be broadened to 0 to 19. And then some other people say that before the youths can get a job, that will take another few years. So it should be 0 to 25. And even the African Union now is talking about an upper limit of the youth age at age 35. So it's a big chunk of people from 0 to 35. I was quoting the number, the global number of youths, proportion 41% of the world population being below age 25. In addition, there are a lot of issues with the data collection, especially when in the DHS surveys, for instance, we don't have much information before age 15. We don't know exactly what's going on between age 10 and 14. Now, second part of the chapter are the youth challenges. And one, of course, is a key one, and it's linked with what we have heard on the demographic dividend, is the human capital formation and access to jobs. And the human capital formation is important, education and health, but it's also another dimension is the human capital preservation. So it's not just good enough to build the human capital, but we need also to preserve the human capital. And thereafter, the youth will need jobs, especially again in sub-Saharan Africa today, where the IMF has estimated that about 1.5 million new jobs would be needed in that region every year. Now, the second issue and the second challenge is the contribution of the youth to the capturing of the first demographic dividends. We have heard the previous presentation about the demographic dividends, but I think more researches need to be done to try to assess the contribution of the youth to the capturing of a first demographic dividends. We are not talking here about the second demographic dividends, which would come later when the proceeds and the benefits of a first demographic dividends would have been saved and invested. And the third and final challenge for the youth, I mean the main challenge, is the youth and national security. I think we are going to hear more on that from Rich Sinkota later. The problem here is that it's difficult to establish causality. We have a lot of correlation, but causality is still a problem to establish clearly. Now I am moving to the third part of the chapter, which are the youth opportunities. And it's really the new thinking today about the transition from youth to adults and citizens. We can divide the youth in many subgroups. There is the adolescents and then the young people, the young adults, etc. And all this work is being undertaken now, but needs to be continued. And the main lesson here would be that the youth development would take an holistic approach and would be multi-sectoral, would work between many different sectors. And what's needed is to really capture the synergies between the different sectors in order to enable the youth to prosper in the society. And that would be the conclusion of this chapter, a research agenda for youth policies and investment. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. We certainly get the sense that demography is not destiny to a political, when we're looking through a political lens here. So next up we have Michael Teitelbaum. And once again, anyone who's joined us, feel free to use the chat and we will have plenty of time for question and answer afterwards. So Tangela, if we can show Michael's when you get a chance, thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at an IUSSP meeting, even if it's only via trillions of pixels. I have only 5 minutes to talk about demographic engineering and strategic demography, so I'm going to limit myself to making 3 points. First, that these topics have long been under-attended by demographers. Second, that most of the subjects that demographers deal with are part and parcel of strategic demography and demographic engineering. And third, that this kind of political demography will be done, but the question is by whom? So it's not a new subject, of course. It goes back to the ancients of Greece and Rome and China and medieval Islamic scholars. But it's fair to say it's been a minor topic for most demographers and political scientists in the current epoch. Early scholarly efforts in the 1970s were not emulated. And the truth is that politicians and their operatives are way ahead of researchers in dealing with these issues. Happily, scholarly attention is now rising, or has been for the last decade or so, especially among political scientists. Demographers are still lagging, but I think they have a great deal to contribute, and I hope they will do so, or you will do so. So what does it mean to engineer mortality and fertility? Well, we know the subject very well in different terminology. Mortality reduction has long been a goal of governments throughout the world. And in the case of wars and genocides, the raising of mortality, but not of their own people typically. Reducing fertility and raising fertility have both been goals of governments around the world for at least a century and possibly more. Migration, the third driver of demographic change, is the one that's most amenable to government policy, and it has the most rapid effects demographically. Now, when it comes to migration, I believe it's correct to say that all states claim they have a sovereign right to control entry across their borders by non-nationals. Some of these states have long promoted immigration, either explicitly, for example, the goal of populate or perish in Australia 100 years ago, or increasing the labor force, or admitting particularly favored ethnic or religious groups as immigrants. There are also implicit policies that promote immigration, largely in the form of weak laws and weak enforcement. And there, I think the United States would have to be one of the top ranking countries in terms of promoting immigration implicitly through such weak laws and enforcement. Some countries have promoted out-migration as well for purposes of employment of their own nationals to generate hard currency remittances sent back by workers abroad, or to exclude or cleanse, as they say, ethnic cleansing, separate from the body politic ethnic and racial groups that are not valued by the governments in power. Now, as far as demographic engineering is concerned, there's a lot of it at the domestic level. Advocacy is often led by interest groups. Some of them promote fertility increases, but migration is a quicker way to increase whatever it is, whatever population you want to increase as an interest group. There have been many efforts as well to manipulate demographic data in the form of the census. There are several countries, at least, that have really been unable to even hold a reliable census for political reasons, to manipulate estimates. And here we might think of the dueling estimates of the Jewish and Palestinian population in the Middle East on the part of the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and manipulation of categories and coding of categories, which one can find quite commonly, especially with reference to issues such as race, religion, and ethnicity. Demographic engineering has also taken on a strategic or international form to engineer higher fertility in a given state for strategic reasons, for example. This kind of strategic pronatalism was seen in Europe at least since the 19th century. By the 1890s in France, and much more commonly in the 1930s, under the governments led by Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, the Swedish government, and others. And then in the post-World War II period, there were allegedly strategic attempts to lower fertility in high fertility countries in the interest of political stability, anti-communism, or other purposes. What about engineering migration as a political strategy? That too has been more common than you might think. The goals have been to establish or to strengthen sovereignty over contested territories, to discredit international adversaries, to support international human rights regimes, and more generally as a tool of asymmetric foreign policy. You notice the red arrow pointing to the cover of a book that is now over a decade old with the catchy title, Weapons of Mass Migration. This book is one of the first to address in a systematic way the use of coerced migration as a strategic tool. And I must say here that within the past few months, we have seen at least 3 cases of this kind of strategic use of migration by the governments of Belarus, of Turkey, and of Morocco. So what could demographers contribute to this subject area? Well, first, credible data and adjudication of contesting claims about data. But second, assessments of how effective all of the policies I've alluded to, mortality, fertility, migration, have been. Analyses that might allow us to anticipate migratory potential and address it. And assessments of the political effects domestically of demographic change. Well, that's my 5 minutes. My final word is that if we don't do such research objectively ourselves, we can be confident that politicians and interest groups will deploy demographic data and quasi-demographic analysis to serve their own interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And there's already a question for you in the chat. So we have one final flash talk here, and that will be with Richard Sincata. Tangela, if you could show that video. And then I have a series of questions for the presenters, but if you have other questions for them, please feel free to send them to me directly in the chat or send them to everyone in the chat and we will get to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. My chapter is entitled Forecasting in Age Structural Time. So what is age structural time? It means that models underlying these forecasts are made in the domain of median age. They become forecast in chronological time when applied to the UN Population Division's projections of median age. Today, I will focus on a single political transition from low to high categories of democracy. My subject is a set of 3 forecasts. These are not current forecasts. They were generated in 2007 to cover the period between 2010 and 2020. They're over. They were part of an unclassified effort supported by the U.S. National Intelligence Council. So let's see how they did. In the age structural model that you see before you, the age structural transition is represented on the bottom axis, stretching from a median age of 15 to 55. Along the vertical axis, we see the probability of being in one of Freedom House's 3 freedom status categories. Free is at the bottom. Stacked above it is partly free, and then stacked on top is not free. Reading the graph is actually quite easy. The probability of being assessed as free by Freedom House is very low for youthful countries, partly because youthful liberal democracies tend frequently to lose their free status rating. Among intermediate countries, the probability of free is moderate, but increases rapidly as countries move through the demographic window. And the demographic window is a region in the middle of the age structural transition, here marked in blue beginning at a median age of about 26 years and ending at around 40 years. Among more mature countries, the probability of being assessed as free has so far remained very high. To that, let's add two observations. First, countries with fewer than 5 million residents do not play by these rules. And single-party regimes, particularly the most strictly ideological, rarely liberalize. Using the UN Population Division's 2006 projections, two expectations seem obvious at the time. First, expect regimes within the demographic window to reach free status and stabilize. Second, expect liberal democracies in the youthful phase of the age structural transition to lose their free status. To forecast, I look for sets of countries that were projected to move into the demographic window during the experimental period. I found two. At the top of the slide is our first choice, the 5 countries of coastal Mediterranean North Africa, stretching from Morocco to Egypt. For our second choice, we chose 3 contiguous countries in the northwest corner of South America, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, shown at the bottom of the slide. In each cluster, we predicted that at least one country would achieve free status between 2010 and 2020 and remain free until 2020. So how did we do? Well, to the surprise of many, the forecast that was most heavily criticized by regional experts, the North African forecast, turned out to be successful. On the other hand, Latin American regional experts considered the South American forecast to be the most plausible. And ironically, this forecast turned out to be unsuccessful. So let's shift gears. Let's test our hypothesis concerning the vulnerability of youthful liberal democracies. Here we focused on West Africa. At the close of 2009, Freedom House assessed 3 states as free: Mali, Ghana, and Benin. We forecast that all would lose free status by 2020. Well, what happened? In this region, a lot happened. However, by the end of 2020, only 1 state remained assessed as free. That was Ghana. Our forecast got quite close to being spot on. Some brief conclusions. Despite our surprising success predicting the emergence of liberal democracy in North Africa, admittedly, it is very difficult to correctly forecast the rise of stable liberal democracy, even among countries passing through the demographic window. Remember that during the 2010 to 2020 experimental period, only 1 country in the world with a population greater than 5 million attained free and kept it, and that was Tunisia. And now its free status is deeply endangered. On the other hand, predicting the demise of liberal democracy among youthful countries is not difficult. So I'm going to end here with one of the paper's overarching conclusions. While astructural forecasting is not intended to be causal, this research strongly suggests that getting into the demographic window is nearly essential for reaching the World Bank's upper middle income category, and similarly, high levels of health status, educational attainment, and government effectiveness. The demographic window matters as well to the attainment and stability of liberal democracy, as we saw in this presentation. How do states get into that portion of the age structural transition? As I noted in this graph, achieving the demographic window apparently requires a TFR to decline to near 2.8 children per woman or below. Thank you, Jen.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. And we're getting a very lively chat about the multiple facets of political demography. So I'm actually going to kick this to a live question for Rich Sankata. Well, last shall be first here. Rich, I know in much of your work, you look not only at age structure, which is clearly not the only predictor of whether or not a country democratizes, but different characteristics of regimes and how those interact with age structure. So could you speak to some of the other factors besides age structure that interact with age structure to produce these political outcomes?
Thank you, Jen. Sure, that's true. This research started with basically looking at dividing the countries up into parts of the age structural transition, and then looking at what was the propensity of them to rise to liberal democracy and then to keep it. And doing that, we found that there were exceptions to each of the rules. And one of the big exceptions is a country that maintains a small population, one less than 5 million is a good indicator. Secondly, countries that, and they just don't, as I said, they don't play by the rules. The second issue is resources. We found that there were countries that had a great deal of natural resources, particularly oil and mineral wealth, that did not necessarily abide by the rules as well. We also found that countries that moved into the age structural transition moved into the demographic window or beyond, if they had extremely one-party states with extremely, particularly when they had extremely ideological governments, those were largely resistant to political change. So what you see, I think the value of this of age structural analysis is that there is a trend, and that trend, what you find is that there are outliers, countries that don't particularly play by the rules, and those can be political, they can be economic reasons, but the fundamental trend is still there and still important.
Great, thank you very much. Education is a theme that has come up in here, and I think we can bring some of this out of the chat. Caitlin, I actually wanted to ask you a question about this because I know PRB has reported some data on education and desired number of children. Where do you see education interacting with some of the age structure work?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I'll just say I totally agree with Dr. Lutz in the chat, and the work that EASA has done to do projections by educational attainment have been a fantastic resource, and one that we ourselves have used at PRB. We would say it's both and. Education is part and parcel of the package of interventions that can help countries attain the dividend. And the interlinkages between age structure and education can be a little bit hard to untangle. And I, to some degree that may or may not matter because we, at least in our view, it is so much of both and. So I'll just say I agree. And I don't know, Dr. Lutz, if you have the link to those great projections on hand. I think they're a fantastic resource. I think, our findings certainly suggest that human capital investments are one of the key policy interventions. And specifically investment in health and education are foundational, and we're in the category of the limited number of specific policy interventions that did have robust evidence on contribution to the dividend. So strong agree.
Education seems to be one of the many policies, but we saw some interesting research in a morning panel on political demography that overlapped with identity. Our focus on that one was identity. And in the research that was presented on Uganda, the author, Catherine Promise-Bira, said that Uganda's youth have really been incorporated into the policymaking of the country, and that is responsible for dampening some of their political angst that in some countries and settings comes out in violence, and in others comes out through the political system. So I think that points us to another area of interaction here, which is the degree of enfranchisement of various groups. And on that, I wanted to turn perhaps to John, or I think Caitlin and Jack also might be well positioned to address that. So are there particular places in the world where we see policies having a really big impact in mediating the strength of the demographics, whether or not to turn into conflictual outcome or peaceful outcome?
Well, no. What we generally find, and this is perturbing, especially given Michael's point about politicians, politicians seem to be willing to pursue demographic policy to their benefits, even if it increases the risk of conflict. You know, the idea that politicians always want peace and order is just not true. So whether it's Turkey weaponizing migration or Belarus lying to would-be immigrants from the Middle East in order to get them to come to the Belarus-Polish border, or places like Uganda, which is promoting a very pro-natal policy, even in a country that's growing at 4%, because the president of Uganda believes the more Ugandans in the world, the better, period. Or you have Hungary kind of trying to put a ban on immigration, even though it's a rapidly aging country that really needs both young people and workers. So I would say, you know, if you ask me, where are people doing something productive and doing helpful things with regard to demographic policies, it's pretty hard to find. Even the Scandinavian countries now are increasingly anti-immigration. And even though they've had some success in promoting fertility, I just think most pronatal policies in the rich world, whether it's in China or in Sweden, are not very effective. So we need, you know, my friend Niels says we need better elites. In a sense, yes, we need elites who are both more aware of the long-term impact of population changes and more aware of how their policies really are not promoting peaceful and more prosperous outcomes.
Excellent. Anyone else from the panel want to add on that? If not, I have more questions. So there's a bit of yeah. Oh, good.
Go ahead. Sorry, please go ahead, Jen.
No, you can go ahead, and then we'll see. And we have a raised hand we can go to next as well.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of diversity globally on that question. There are a number of countries doing some really creative and ambitious work around sort of the kind of across the different pillars of the demographic dividend. And I think increasingly happening in a context that importantly is centering women and their individual choices and preferences around family size, while you know, simultaneously investing in interventions that have a robust evidence base around moving towards a demographic dividend. And increasingly also some really interesting work by a number of countries to measure and monitor progress towards the dividend, which I think is worth paying attention to. I know Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal have all introduced kind of measurement frameworks for watching progress towards the dividend. I would say in addition to that, there's some increasing work happening at the subnational level that's worth paying attention to. So I do think there's some important and really positive momentum and some interesting work kind of coming out of different countries that is worth following and will inform a lot of this discussion over the next decade.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Let's go to the three raised hands in order. I saw Mohammed first and Alika and then Wolfgang.
Okay. Good evening here from Tehran. Thank you very much to the presenters. And I've read the papers by these authors and I enjoyed them. And I agree that population has policy and political implication. But the points presented in the papers that I've read so far, not only in this presentation, I think they present a simplistic view of the relationship between population and politics. And I agree with Wolfgang that I think we have to present a deeper understanding of the relationship and the complication and the complex relationship between population and politics. My worry is that, unfortunately, we demographers don't talk much on politics, and political advocates use these statements and misuse it for their own political purpose. I'm sorry to say that, Jack, I know your point. I know that Rich has written some on the implication of age structural change for the Middle East, for the Arab Spring, etc., and even on Iran. That, I mean, one of the points that Rich mentioned earlier, will Iran be the next China? And when you go to the paper, he only talks about age structure, not about education, not about other implications that demographic trends has. My point here is that we demographers, as several of you have indicated, I think it was I'm not sure which one mentioned that, I think we demographers need to work with political scientists, not political advocates. We need to offer political demography in our teaching sort of courses. I'm sure you are doing, but I see the lack of training for both demographers, how to engage with policies, with politics, and also we have to train political scientists of the implications and the complex relationship between population, demographic change, and politics. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Jack, do you want to respond to any of that before we go to Alka? Or
Great, go for it. Yes, we need more layers of complexity. One of the difficulties, of course, is, we try and work with global data sets, but many countries don't want to collect data, for example, on racial, religious, or ethnic identification in their populations for obvious reasons. But we can do better by working at national or regional levels rather than simply staying with global data sets. But that does require the cooperation, as you say, of local experts who are political scientists who know their regions and their societies and are willing to add a variety of demographic inputs. The good news is it's been hard to teach courses in political demography because we haven't had the books to assign. Thank goodness now with these 3 books that are recently out, there's good material of global range that we can now use to tailor courses on political demography to both the undergraduate and graduate audience. And I hope we'll start doing that and that people will come up with far greater insights than the simplifications we have so far.
Great, thank you. Alka, I think you had mentioned some things in the chat about education and some qualities. If you'd like to comment, please feel free to.
Yeah. Hi, did you ask me? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you can see me. Okay. Yeah, I've already said that in the comment, and because I myself used to like Wolfgang, be a great advocate for the education as a magic bullet, and it is at some level. But what we are seeing now is, instead of education leading to being the pathway to things like employment, or in my case, the work I'm doing is on marriage. That you need to be, you're a bigger catch in the marriage market if you're educated. Education is becoming a way really of killing time for a whole lot of people who are not very poor because they have to take any work they get, and who are not educated enough to get good jobs. These are really, it's more qualitative stuff by anthropologists on young men in India who are really just using education as a way of appearing busy, both to their families and to society, because they can't do any of the other things that being a young man of 25 years or 26 is supposed to be. He can't take on the responsibilities of a job. There is no job. He can't take on the responsibilities of marriage and a family because he's a poor catch in the marriage market. And so the only way he can appear busy and masculine and important, at least to himself, is to be registered for one stupid course after another. If you go outside any small town or city in India, you'll see loads of these strange sounding computer science and engineering and technical studies educational institutions with young men just hanging outside and not actually doing anything. So I don't know how we think about it, but we do maybe need to use some of the stuff from the political impacts of these. These are people waiting to cause trouble. And I think, at least from what I see in India, that the trouble that they can cause can be pretty bad. So we need to think about what we mean when we say student and student enrollment.
Great, that's a really useful, and I just put in the chat that Valerie Hudson has some work on this. And I know that in political demography, we have a strong tradition of looking at how well integrated people are into the political realms, the economic realms, and the social realms, and the social part is certainly in that. And I think we might even look to the case of Saudi Arabia and mismatch between the labor market, the available human capital. We get to bring the migration piece into this, political regime type, and so many more complex factors. So our next hand is Wolfgang Lutz and then Rich Sankata.
Well, thanks again for a really interesting paper. So, and also just responding to Alaka here, I'm not going to make the case for education being any silver bullet. It really depends on the educational distribution, how many of what category you have. But for doing this analysis, we need to have the data. So I'm really want to go back and ask a rather fundamental question: what is demography? I mean, this may sound trivial, but typically when people talk about demographic change, they only talk about size and age structure. That's what comes to the mind, both of most demographers as well as politicians. But that's neither the original meaning, like all the original textbooks, and the classic definition talks about changing population size and structures in the plural. The textbook by Schreyer and Siegel, which is really a sort of a classic in the field, very explicitly that demographers deal with the variables that are usually collected in censuses, in particular education, labor force participation, place of residence. These are real demographic factors, and I dare to say almost the same relevance as age and sex. Age, sex, and education, they all have elements of physical and as well as social construction. Jack Gawson has already mentioned there in the chat that, I mean, age is not what it used to be. A 70-year-old, while it's like 60-year-old in the past. We are redefining age. Chronological age is different from healthy age. The same, the gender is not anymore as clear bifurcation between male and female as it used to be. And the same with education. It has some physical elements. Once you build new synaptic structures in your brains, they stay there for the rest of your life, and you build all your learning experience. So it's physical as well as social construction. And in demography, that's my question, when we talk about political demography, we should equally talk about the impact, not just of changing age structure, but also of changing education structure and labor force structure. And then the world looks quite different. There has been political science, so much work from Lipset and many others since then, about how education interrelates with democracy, and of course with all the cross interactions with age. So the point I'm wanting to make, that when we talk about demographic change, let's not only talk about this narrow-minded age structure.
Thank you very much. And I'm so glad that you're mentioning that, because we do see this when you dig into the meat of the chapters in this book, and also the one that Jack mentioned for global political demography. And I'm putting a couple of these in the chats, because if you are interested in these ideas, the morning panel, we talked a lot about perception of demographic change. It doesn't even matter what the data are, although we always want great data because we can certainly use that. But in political demography, it's just the idea that people think things are changing that ends up showing up in our political outcomes. And then I'm going to put a couple more links in the chat. Rich, please go ahead.
Rich, you're muted.
Rich, you're muted.
that was maybe a good thing. So let's see. What I said is that my job has been to go in the other direction. And I'll make this quite simple, is that I was tasked by the intelligence community to simplify things, to get past some of the discussions that happen in the intelligence community that sound very much like the ones we're having here now, that says we need more and more to understand things and to introduce this complexity into our analysis. My job was to eliminate it. And what I did is just to look at the relationships that have existed between population age structure and aspects of development, essentially, both political and socioeconomic. And those relationships are quite strong. However, as I said, what you see are outliers that probably embody some of the complexities that we're talking about. But that was not of importance to the international, the intelligence community, nor to the foreign service or defense communities. They wanted to know what was going to happen in the future in a general way. And that's what that analysis does. And it's likely to, of course, I always say piss people off, because that's the way, because it really works. So that was the idea of my presentation today, was to show how forecasts could do pretty well, not perfectly, and how they could address some of the problems that foreign affairs people face when looking into the future. And so I'll leave it there. I will say one point about education is that when you look at educational attainment, as Caitlin pointed to, it's very difficult to separate age structure from, say, high school attainment. They sort of go in. You can look at individual countries and see variation, but when you look at the general trend, they go hand in hand. The same with with the economic development. The same with measures of state capacity. It's quite surprising, and it's also quite surprising how the UN Population Division was able to identify this area in 2004 between a median age of 26 and 40, where this kind of behavior, where countries would enter upper middle levels of development, where this would occur. And I wish we had done more work on the demographic window. It's been a sort of a key issue in my research, and it's been the uptake of that in the foreign service and intelligence communities is quite palpable. They really look at this now, and it's become a way to do forecasting. And I'll leave it there, Jen.
Jen, I can't find the raise hand symbol.
Please.
Can I say something? I just want to pick up on what Wolfgang Lutz said. I agree with his point that we shouldn't focus solely on age and similar narrow demographic structure categories. But I would add that in political terms, I think the most volatile structural elements of populations are the same ones that social scientists describe as socially constructed. Structural elements such as race or ethnicity or religion, language, national origin, all of these are changeable and can be redefined, changeable by individuals, maybe not race, but the racial categories are changeable, and changeable over time within societies. So the very notion of race has changed dramatically over the past century in many of these countries. The tendency, though, unfortunately, I think, is to say, well, they're socially constructed variables, so they're not really worth talking about. And I think that's a mistake, because they are socially constructed, but they are also often the most politically volatile and most politically relevant variables in political terms. And if we tend to devolve into very abstract concepts, we take a human being and we say, well, that person has the following education level, or that person has the following skill set, or that person has the following age. But it's much more complicated than that in terms of the way the politics work on these subjects. So I would urge that we not ignore these socially constructed elements of fertility differentials, mortality differentials, and migration. I think they turn out to be, in many ways, the most important in political terms.
Thank you. I'm going to go to John and Jack, but I'm going to seed this question first. So we have both in the chat and in the comments some questions about really our wording, what we mean by policies. Is political demography studying policies? Because demographers might also study policies. The difference between policies, politics, and then to Rich's point, taking political demography, translating it for policy makers. So that's the word policy or politics 3 times, but meaning really 3 different things here. So what I would like to ask some of our presenters after John and Jack speak is, what is political demography? Why is it useful? Because this is a conference focused on demographers, I think it's best for us to talk about why is it useful for demographers. In other settings, we might say, we spend a lot of our time, those many of us on here, trying to convince political scientists why they should look at demography. So now we need to think about doing the opposite. So John and then Jack.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. I think Mohammad Jalal and also Tom Legrand on the chat raised the question of the difference between policy and politics and the linkages between the both. And I think it's one of the most difficult issue in population policies to really try to see the impact of politics on policies. And I don't think it's a very clear relationship. This being said, I think sometimes we ask political scientists to look more at demography, but I think demographers should ask political scientists to look more at politics versus policies. Thank you.
Jack.
Thank you. Wolfgang is certainly correct, but it all depends on what we're looking at for our kind of dependent variables. What do we want to explain? If we want to explain fertility variation, education is as or more important than many other elements. But for political demography, the outcomes we're generally most interested in are regime type, transitions to democracy or dictatorship, issues of peace and conflict. What are the odds for stability versus civil war versus ethnic war versus revolutions? And longer term political economy, what's kind of the relative configuration for international peace and war, something that Jennifer herself has done some research on. Generally, political scientists have simply dismissed the impact of all kinds of demographic variables on all of these outcomes of great interest. Adam Przeworski, in his kind of classic book on democracy and development, reported very strong results relating fertility levels to democracy, and he didn't know what to do with it. He said, I see these results, but they don't make any sense to me, so I'm going to set them aside and focus on the variables that I'm familiar with. So there's clearly a space for political scientists to do better, incorporating a great variety of demographic variables. That's what all of us have been trying to do in these volumes. And although, as Wolfgang's correct, it's often easiest to work with numbers and age structure, as that's most frequently reported globally, but that's also inadequate in many circumstances. And we do have better data on education, on ethnic and racial identities, on urban-rural distribution that we can and should also incorporate. I'll simply point out that a lot of the effects are somewhat ambiguous. For example, globally, higher education is correlated with greater likelihood of stable democracy. But locally and in the short term, that doesn't hold. So all of the Arab uprising countries had huge increases in education, including both secondary and tertiary education before the Arab uprisings. The problem was their economies were not providing jobs appropriate to educated youth, leading to extremely high rates of youth unemployment and frustration in the transition to adulthood. Similarly, China and Russia, in terms of primary and secondary education, have among the highest levels in the world, virtually universal, yet they've been stubbornly resistant to democracy. So there are a lot of puzzles we need to figure out. Among others, the entire world is slowly transitioning to vertical population pyramids. That is, countries are getting older, fertility is dropping. Most of the world's institutions are geared to pyramidal populations. That is, they have education systems, social mobility systems, tax revenue systems, public expenditure, all geared to the idea that younger cohorts will be larger than aging cohorts. And as that situation is fading, we need to assess the political consequences. Will it be intergenerational conflict? Will it be overt violence in some countries? Will it be regime transitions? So there's a great deal that we don't know, a great deal to understand. And my thanks to Wolfgang and his group in Vienna for pointing out that age structure can be looked at in different ways. And I hope you're right, Wolfgang, that education increase will completely offset our concerns about continued high fertility. But I do think there's a lot of empirical work and a lot of theoretical work that needs to be done, because what we see over and over is that demographic variables have different political outcomes in different contexts. So understanding those contexts, how they mediate outcomes, is going to be a crucial task for the future.
I think that's a really great synopsis there at the end too, of how many of us see political demography. You might have the same demographic trend, but it turns out with very different political outcomes in different places, and why. So under what conditions? But let me put Michael Teitelbaum on the spot here. So the question I had seeded was, why should people who come from a strong demography background pay any attention to political demography? Is there anything from that exercise that they could learn from or would enhance their own research? And you have been doing this for a very long time, and I've certainly learned from you over a couple of decades. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, a simple answer to that is that if demographers don't pay attention to the political drivers of demographic change and to the political effects of demographic change, they're missing a large part of reality. And others will do it, and they will do it with self-interest in mind. They will make arguments that most demographers would consider to be ill-founded or specious arguments. They will use selectively or incorrectly demographic data to make their case. So as I said at the end of my 5 minutes, somebody is going to do this kind of research. And I think it would be a lot better for everyone if demographers were involved in doing this kind of research, and political scientists, instead of leaving it to political operatives, pundits, journalists, and politicians who I think almost universally should not be expected to do things in an objective way.
Thank you. Okay, please, if anyone else has any questions, let us know. Yes, Mohammed.
Hi, Jennifer. I wanted to thank you very much for the discussions raised at this meeting. And I think it's very important to, as Michael said, I was just reviewing Michael's paper with my PhD students last week about the importance of, training demographers to be involved in, let's say, political demography. Putting the idea of population and politics in a simple way that Rich was saying, I think has the implication that politicians or political scientists who are in the, what they call it, or the policymakers and have the power will only focus on the numbers of population or age structure of the population, which is a very passive way of looking at population. So age structural transition will happen eventually. So, okay, let it go. If it's young, then there might be some political problems, but if it gets old, then we have a conservative society by voting, etc., etc. But I think if we present a view that, I mean, as our colleague on demographic dividend was saying, that investing on education, investing on health and other aspects, I think that would be a better way of convincing political activists and also pundits, as Michael was saying, to look at policy making in a more complex and possibly realistic way. So that was my point, because the main aim of demography and either teaching or research is to contribute to the well-being of the people. And if we want to have a realistic policy, then the number of population is one thing, but the composition of the population, as Wolfgang was saying, is another thing. I think that going on the investment on education would be, I think, more realistic and needed way that would be, in my view, in favor of the people and also the well-being of the people. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will give one of our last comments to Richard Sincata, but before we do so, if anyone has any recent work that they'd like to plug, particularly on any of these, please feel free to copy and paste it in the chat. I know we all would love to learn more about each other's work. Okay, Rich.
Okay, thank you. I'm not I'm not going to I try to sort of make peace here, is that I think I agree with everything that that Jalal and Alka and Wolfgang have said about the complexity and the desire, the need to look closer at what exactly is going on. I will, though, I wonder, because I see such strong trends that are statistically viable and that are even useful for forecasting, and as I've shown, with fairly positive results. You can't dismiss them. So there's something happening at the population level, and that's why I think there is a demography as a science, because things are happening at a population level that are not necessarily reflected in looking at smaller units or even individuals. Yet, what we seem to do is we're always trading back and forth like there's no dividing line. There is a dividing line here. Population, sort of demographic views on a population level are not necessarily good enough to reflect on policies at an individual level. On the other hand, all of these statements about how difficult things are in terms of education and how qualitative differences there are do not necessarily transfer to the statistical population level. There's something going on in terms of big numbers that allows for prediction, fairly good predictions. So I'll just leave it there, is that I think demography is a bit confused. We seem to walk back and forth between these levels, knowing full well that they are not the same thing at all. And matter of fact, that's one, I just came back from a tour of pushing a publication that we did at the Atlantic Council on the Sahel, demography in the Sahel. And the biggest questions are, well, how come people can be so energetic when they're youthful and so creative, and yet how can you say that there's a risk of conflict and disorder with youthful populations? And that's the same problem. You just multiply these people and add them to the institutions that are available at the country level, and you don't have that same relationship anymore. And I think that's a problem demography has somehow walked into, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rich. Okay, well, we will end on time, but the session does stay open if anyone feels so moved to stay on. But I want to thank everyone. I would like to thank those who took the time to present today, and also those of you who attended, and hopefully will take away that there are plenty of unanswered questions. While we have found lots of relationships that can be used for forecasting and for policymakers, we also recognize that there are a lot of things still left to be answered, which I think is great news if you have any graduate students or if you yourself are a graduate. And so please check out many of the books that have been linked in the chat, and connect. And thank you also to IUSSP and Tom for encouraging us to bring political demography to IUSSP. Thank you.
Jennifer,
Yeah, John.
when is your next book coming out?
Mine is end of March. So that one is, yeah. And I thank goodness do look at all of these things. So it'd be a little too late if I didn't. I'll like, cover it all the details.